there was a hashtag for World Cup. Oh, there is.
They spent however many millions on this event. I would assume that they could pay to get the hashtag.
129. It's 129, right?
Yep.
Tweet. Gotta get the links. Whoa. You really showing me?
Yep. That's fixed now. Happens every 5 or 10 episodes because there's two things I'm looking at.
YouTube. Alrighty.
All right, you ready to get started?
Yep.
Hello and welcome to episode 129 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking about the Esports World Cup, I think it was $1.5 million tournament, $1.8 million tournament in Saudi Arabia, featuring all but one of the CDL teams and a few top challenger teams. And we also have some roster mania adjacent stuff, and I mean, could be some big news regarding the Boston breach, but we'll get to that later. And before we get to any of the Esports World Cup stuff, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Like you said, we, kind of have talked about it a couple weeks ago now at this point, how this, was a bit of an interesting period in most seasons because we weren't entering the off season right after champs as we had more recently. We had this Esports World Cup tournament. And there's, some narratives around that and the significance of this event and whatnot due to just like it being after champs and how much it means, all that. But end of the day, we got to, see some Call of Duty action again this weekend. And now the 2024 season for MW3 is officially over. And it's time to fully, see what we're going to get in roster mania ahead of Black Ops 6.
Yeah, I think the idea of this tournament is cool, that you have this really, like $1.8 million. That's a lot of money. That's nearly the total prize pool of champs. But at the same time, it is not champs. Like, there's no prestige with the Esports World Cup in general. We've had the Esports World Cup in the past. ESWC, I think that was in France that one year that I think it was Clay threw his medal across the stands or something like that. But I mean, in general, champs is the big event to close out the season. It's the most important tournament in terms of Call of Duty esports. But this tournament, since it happened, only a month after champs, I think it gave us kind of a good idea of like maybe what we could expect in terms of rosters. But I also think there's some kind of, this could cause more rosters, and the importance of this event, I'm sure we'll talk about as well. But I think off the top, we need to talk about FaZe, because this was a team that we talked so much about throughout the CDL season. A major champion, but disappointed at the end of the season, did not reach what we thought their potential could have been. But then they come to Saudi Arabia, they win $600,000, the grand prize. They beat 100 Thieves in the grand finals and cap off the season with a championship. I'm sure some FaZe fans will try to argue that this is just as important as a COD Champs win. I think we both know, and most people know, that that's not the case, but they do go out on a big note. So how important is this for FaZe? And as we've talked about in the past, we we just discussed the possibility of a roster change with this team, considering the sour note that they ended on with the CDL season. Does this change your mind, or do you believe this will change FaZe's mind in terms of a roster change heading into the actual offseason?
So I think first and foremost, just put it to bed. I think that any comparisons between Esports World Cup and COD champs in terms of just the prestige and how much it means for simply winning the title, they can't compare at this point. And COD champs is everything, so that's always going to be reign supreme in that category. But you can't ignore the prize pool factor of this. So you can say whatever you want about you know not winning champs but winning World Cup and vice versa. But at the end of the day, these players are getting a lot of money put in their bank accounts because they won this tournament. So that's what, to me, that's what is most likely um the motivation, I guess you can say, for a tournament like this. And it's just that's what is the significance of it. It's that you're not getting a ring. You're not
They get a
names not
triangle,
going.
right?
Well, yeah, that was kind of cool, but yeah. End of the day, I think that's what the importance of this is really in that monetary value. It's especially we've talked about prize pools and just the number of tournaments that are had over the course of a year in the CDL era, all that stuff we've talked about on numerous episodes. Adding another tournament with almost $2 million prize pool, like that's for these guys working their butts off all season and having an extra tournament to compete at, that's really cool. And that shit, it can't compete to the prestige of champs. So that's where I stand on that. I don't even think it's really a debate. It's just anybody thinking like Esports World Cup is more meaningful than COD champs. I don't think you can really argue that. But it is what it is. In terms of FaZe, I think this was a super important victory for them outside of the monetary stuff I was just going through, because of what you said there. Like they had those struggles at champs. Literally, their worst placing of the year came at the last event of the CDL season, and in under normal circumstances, if that was the final event and we're heading into roster mania, we even kind of talked about it the last time we did after champs, where it's like, is this the end of that FaZe trio of Simpa, Beasley, and Celium? Like, are they going to consider making a move because of this placing? Now, I think winning this tournament was important for multiple reasons in that regard. It not only proved that they can win with this roster and prove that they can rebound from what was their worst, placing of the year. But it just the fact that they were able to close out another grand finals is important for this FaZe team, because that's what has been questioned about FaZe so much over this CDL era. Is like, yeah, they get to a lot of grand finals, but it feels like they get a lot of seconds, which is naturally going to happen if you're getting in the finals and
Yeah.
you don't win every single time. Um, and even in this grand finals against 100 Thieves, which that's a whole other topic in itself, that they were in a finals against 100 Thieves of the last MW3 tournament. Uh, they win the first hard point of the grand finals, but then 100 Thieves comes out and wins a 6-5 search and a 3-2 control to take a 2-1 series lead. And I'm watching this grand finals and 100 Thieves take that 2-1 lead, and I'm like, oh, are we going to go on the podcast again and have to talk about, Atlanta FaZe losing another grand finals and what this means for the legacy, all that, yada, yada. But then Simba and the boys came out, took the next three maps pretty convincingly outside, invasion control. It was fitting. I'm pretty sure the final round again was an offensive win on invasion control in overtime. I believe that's what it was at Champs 2 for Optic against Subliners. And the amount of time we've talked, or I have talked about invasion control and offense on invasion control in particular this year, it's fitting that once again another tournament ends with a offensive offensive round 5 win on invasion control. But nevertheless, yeah, that's where my head was at with that. Victory for FaZe now. Important in terms of for the players too, even not even like who cares what the community thinks from their perspective, right? But like for they themselves to, just have that feeling again of knowing they can win in the grand finals. Obviously, all those guys know they're really good players and they know they can win, but doing it and reassuring themselves has got to feel good. And like I was saying a couple minutes ago, that cash hit in the bank account's going to feel good too.
Yeah, it's such an interesting event and win for FaZe because they even beat Optic in this run. So they beat the defending world champions who, were on top of the world a month ago. And granted, FaZe has really not struggled with Optic themselves this season. I think someone said they are like 6-1 or something along those lines. Like, regardless of the actual record, FaZe has kind of gotten over the Optic boogeyman that's been haunting them the last few years. It's been some of the other teams, at Champs, they notably lost to the New York Subliners in the winners bracket, dropped down, lose to Toronto Ultra in the losers bracket. They didn't play either of those. Obviously, New York Subliners were Cloud9 at this event, and Toronto was on the other side of the championship bracket, and they lost to 100 Thieves, who FaZe beat twice at this event. First in the group stage, a sweep, and then, like you said, 4-2 in the grand final. So it's really interesting. I do think that it should give FaZe confidence that this roster, these 4 players can win together and that they will win together again. That's what I thought after they won. I believe it was Major 2. That was, okay, they finally did it. They got the monkey off their back. They're back. They weren't necessarily back, but I think that might just simply be that the league is more competitive at the top than ever before. Those top 4 teams that we talked about all season long were all capable of winning a championship, and I guess we'll get to Toronto later and how capable they have been. But I would say FaZe, they should keep this roster. I don't know if I would have the same exact opinion. I don't even remember what my opinion was after Champs in regards to FaZe and what they should do with this team. But this should give them a lot of confidence to keep moving forward with this 4. Whether that actually happens, I think that remains to be seen, and we'll have to see what happens with some of the other rosters. That was something that we had talked about after Champs. If one of those top 4 teams made a roster change, how would it affect those other top 4 teams, whether they would make a roster change? And I still think that is in play, especially with a team like Toronto. But let's talk about 100 Thieves, because they're kind of like the story of this tournament. For as much as FaZe should get the credit, and they were able to get past their whatever Sunday scaries, if you want to call them that, with how much people have been talking about their semifinal and final troubles. But 100 Thieves, they had one of the best finishes to the season that I can remember in some time, from a team that really was not expected to do much. Of course, during the regular season, they were kind of floating between like 5 and 8 from at any point, and I think they were kind of surprising in a good way that they were competitive against some of these top teams, but they were still decidedly below the top 4 that we had kind of anointed at the beginning of the season. They were completely different at the end of this season. And one of the biggest things is that they seem to have Toronto Ultra's number. They come out, of course, they lose to FaZe in the group play, but they get out of group play. They get into the bracket. They play the Toronto Ultra again in the first round of the bracket, just like they did at Champs. And just like they did at Champs, they beat Toronto and they advanced to the semifinals. And then there they beat the Vancouver Surge, which is another story in and of itself. And then they get to the grand final, lose to FaZe, who I don't think anyone's going to begrudge 100 Thieves for not beating Atlanta. It's a rivalry, obviously, going back a few years from their World Championship grand finals and all that. But 100 Thieves, this is a team that should stick together, and this is not something that I think we expected, especially coming into this season. They made roster changes during this season, and that kind of proved that it was not a solid thing. Ghosty obviously has been solid all year, a fringe all-star, like we talked about a few episodes ago. But some of those other guys were trying to maybe rehab their value or see if they could stick with a team. This was seen as like a rebuilding year after 100 Thieves championship roster disbanded. So what do you think about 100T at this point, after finishing, I believe, top 4 at champs and now second place at the Esports World Cup to finish off the season?
Yeah, I do think that it's an interesting conversation to be had about around potentially uh, keeping the roster and not making a roster change, which is kind of just, you know, it's weird to think about potentially keeping a roster together that didn't win a tournament or, uh, obviously made the finals of this tournament, but at the end of the day, they still didn't hoist a trophy. So
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, without knowing the actual details of the players' contracts based on what we know about 100 Thieves as a business and wanting to cut costs, try to get as close to profitability as possible. It is very likely that a lot of these players are on contracts that are not that lucrative or are somewhat close to the minimum. Um, and based on the way like the 1+1 contracts work, it technically wouldn't be expensive to just extend all these guys for 100 Thieves and have them for one more year on LAT. Um, at the same time, though, we both know the type of person Nadeshot is and how competitive he is and how much he wants his teams to win and all that stuff. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation to see whether they stick with this team or if they try to make some moves to, get some other players involved. And the other thing I know we did talk about last time we were live is just Ghosty. Like, if another team decides they were really impressed with him this year, if they throw a bag at him, is LAT going to even try to match it, or is he just going to walk and then they have to start from scratch, essentially? So, um, interesting conversation to be had there. But yeah, I mean, definitely was not expecting LAT to be one of the teams in the finals of Esports World Cup, but that's just the way the bracket worked out, and the top half was heavy because Cloud9 slash Subliners didn't get first place in their group. If they did that, they would have been in the bottom half of the bracket and potentially would have been in the grand finals, making it through that if things worked out that way. But um, you know, that's just the way the tournament unfolded. And top half of the bracket was pretty spicy with Optic versus Cloud9. Then obviously Optic plays Atlanta. Um, Whereas you got Vancouver Surge slash Seattle Surge going up against 100 Thieves for a shot at the grand finals in the lower half. That's just something a lot of people probably wouldn't have expected if they were filling out brackets before this event. But yeah, you got to tip your hats to those guys. They definitely 100 Thieves, LAT definitely played their best COD at the end of the year. That's been a talking point for us on this show all throughout the last couple months, and that's what they were able to go out and do. I was in particular, I was impressed by Kremp in several search and destroys. I think he had 15 or 16 kills in the Game 5 search against Toronto to send them home. And even I think it was the game 2 against Atlanta in the grand finals. He had another double-digit kill performance. So I was pretty impressed by him. Even even though me and you have both talked about Ghosty at length, I saw some flashes from him. Joe Deceives had some good moments as well, standing out, and Nasty's kind of just doing his thing, filling in the gaps, and obviously LAT found something that helped them go into that next gear towards the end of the season, and got them some decent paydays from the last 2 events, which are the biggest events. So, will be interesting to see what they do as an organization, franchise, and in terms of potential roster moves and whatnot. I do think Ghosty will be the key piece there. If they're able to keep him around, then it's probably more likely that they keep the rest of the guys around him. Whereas I think if Ghosty is like essentially poached or acquired by another team, I think it's more likely that they would just blow it up and try to do something else. But that's just speculation at that time. We got a couple months now to see how it all plays out.
I think that's really what is the most intriguing part of this tournament. I talked about it like I wasn't super excited for this tournament. Like it's the off season. I think like mentally I was already checked out. Like champs happened. Like my body, my mind is already used to that year over year. Okay, that's the end of the season. No more COD for whatever 5 6 months. This is kind of like a change, obviously, and it wasn't as exciting for me personally. But that's what's intriguing is that is this fool's gold essentially that idea for most of these teams actually. Like I don't think optics going to change. I think that would be foolish of them to consider that regardless of however they did at this event. But for a team like FaZe, who we had talked about previously, for a team like 100 Thieves, who they were a middling team for most of the season, and then really kind of they nearly beat Optic at Champs. They beat Toronto and then lost to Toronto at Champs, and then here they gave FaZe a really tough match and beat Toronto. So they've really kind of proven themselves against some of these top four teams, but it's it should you really judge too much on the end of the season, or should you try to take advantage? And we've talked about 100 Thieves specifically trying to be like a profitable esports organization, especially with Call of Duty. And if like you said, someone throws a bag at Ghosty, and if he's even under contract, like, and someone throws a bag, say, hey, like we'll buy him out for however much amount, like you have to at least take that call. You have to at least think about it. But yeah, I don't see this team as a championship contender as currently constructed if you go into next season. But at the same time, like maybe that's not as important. Like maybe you're not going to be able to build an all-star roster to compete against Atlanta, Toronto, Optic, and Cloud9. Like I don't see like 12 players, or I don't really see 4 players out there that they could realistically sign that is going to make a huge difference for 100 Thieves fortunes next year. But we'll see. I think the same could be said with Vancouver Surge, and we should mention that it's no longer the Seattle Surge, who have been unimpressive for most of their CDL history, even though some of the last few seasons have not been too bad. But now they are officially the Vancouver Surge. This was a change that happened like in the lead up to the Esports World Cup, as most of these teams were announcing different things. We've been talking about 100 Thieves. That was actually the Los Angeles Thieves for the last few seasons. They changed all of their branding, I think, and Twitter account to 100 Thieves. I don't know if that's a permanent thing, but I would imagine so. Obviously, we've talked about in the past Cloud9, the New York Subliners becoming C9. And I guess the Vancouver Surge thing is the latest part of that. I've talked about how I feel about the city-based stuff, but I think they're more in tune with Vancouver because, if I'm not mistaken, they're owned in part, at least, by the Vancouver Canucks owners. So that fits, and that's good, like a good relationship. But as far as this tournament goes, they were very surprising. They obviously they beat Cloud9, aka NYSL, in groups. They beat G2, aka the Minnesota Rocker, and then they beat the Royal Ravens in the bracket, and they lose to 100 Thieves in the semifinals to get top 4 alongside Optic. Anything with Vancouver, either the brand or the or the actual performance in this event. This is a team that, unlike 100 Thieves, I don't think you could say, well, we're not going to make a roster change, going into next season. But a player like Abuza, who made some headlines simply from his kind of trash talk of Gwyn after the quarterfinal matchup. I think he's a guy to build around, but as far as the overall team, I don't see like a long-term future with this specific 4.
Yeah, so that's the thing for me is I do think, again, keeping in mind the business aspect of it, it's very possible that guys like Abuza, 04, and even to an extent Brezzy are probably on somewhat low contracts. Abuza was kind of hyped hyped up coming into this past season as a potential prospect. So there could have been a potential bidding war that would have, brought his price up a little bit. That's obviously just speculation. But end of the day, I think that's the biggest question for Vancouver slash Seattle now is do they only stick with Abuza or do they try to do Abuza plus oh 04? Because I feel like oh 04 definitely had his moments this year. He really stood out to me and on several occasions. And I know Ali said it like in one tournament. It was like towards the beginning of when he first joined the team. It's like this guy. It feels like every single map he has a cruise missile, and I feel like after I heard her say that on the desk and like I started watching him, it was like holy shit, yeah, this guy is almost going on a streak, going like every single game. It feels like he played pretty well, and he stood out to me in search in a lot of moments too. Um, so I do think that's an option. It's also possible due to that chemistry with Abuza and Brezzy. Like maybe they try to re-sign Brezzy, keep him on as a sub. At the same time, they could try to do that same thing with oh 04 if they want to like go out and get three guys to put around Abuza. But they have oh 04 on a cheap contract. They could have him stick around as a substitute. I don't. I think he has kind of worked his way into a conversation of a starting spot. So that'd be interesting to see. But yeah, definitely was interested and surprised by Vancouver's performance at this event. I'm just going to stop saying Vancouver and say Surge because it's messing with my own head to say it. Um, but yeah, in particular, they were able to beat New York slash Cloud9 in the group play to get that first seed, which put them in that lower bracket spot where they were able to play against Carolina and inevitably 100T, which, if you're going to be in the side of a bracket with a shot to make the grand finals, that's definitely where you'd rather be, even though they just beat Cloud9 versus being up top there with Optic Cloud9 and FaZe. Like, I'd much rather take my chances in the bottom half of the bracket for this one. Um, but yeah, end of the day, I was surprised by Vancouver. I was a little surprised too by the trash talk with Abuza, beefing a little bit with Gwen. Even saw Gwen say like, I've never really talked to the guy, and he's saying this stuff, and then Abuza was like, oh, you've been talking trash in scrims or something like that, and even Gwen's like, you can't take scrims seriously or something. I was kind of like, so I don't think it's necessarily a language barrier or anything like
No.
that. I hope it's just, I like the trash talk, and if this is something that Abuza keeps as a chip on his shoulder every single time he plays Gwen for the rest of the time both of them are in the CDL, then I guess we get like another version of Scrap versus Draza to a much less extreme scenario there. But yeah, definitely surprised by Surge's performance. Um, Again, another situation here where they had their best performance of the year at the end. So um, probably I think probably would have been the same conversation around whether you keep just Abuza or you blow it up. And I don't know. I feel like there are multiple directions the team can go in, but I do think it's kind of similar to a 100 Thieves situation where they will probably want to try to keep Abuza around, but could he potentially get another offer from another team that's more lucrative, and that changes Seattle's entire plans for the offseason? I don't know. I feel like that's where more of the potential intrigue from Roster Mania could come, since it sounds like we could be in a situation where if some of these teams are just re-signing some of these players, it might not be as exciting of a Roster Mania as in previous off seasons.
Yeah, I just don't see that happening, like, personally, because I think if you look at like the stats every year, it's like sometimes all 12 teams make changes. I think that
Yeah,
happened last season, I think. Um,
yeah,
because
because of New
even New York,
York.
yeah,
Yeah,
so every team made a change, but usually you have like all but one, maybe two teams make changes. I mean, technically some of these teams have already like made swaps. Like Boston pretty much overhauled their entire roster except Snoopy, and we'll see what happens with them. But as far as Vancouver goes, like it just feels like they didn't have a good enough season or even like a good enough end to the season like 100 Thieves to kind of justify not making a change, where that's kind of the case with pretty much every team typically, that even at the end of the season, like I think the only other thing that I can think of would be like the Seattle Surge, like after Pred and Sib's first year. I think they stuck with the same roster heading in with like Mac and Accuracy.
Yeah.
And even then, like we were talking about like, well, they make a change because they obviously didn't win champs. I don't remember if they even won an event. But that's the kind of stuff like they were a much like higher potential team in my opinion, at least. And they were one of the rare teams that still didn't make a roster change. So I do think that it'll eventually happen for the Surge lineup. But one last thing on Abuza, I am positive it is not a language barrier. I just think that they like talking trash to each other. But I saw that Gwen's mom got involved
Yes.
as well, which was amazing. And I think Abuza even was like, "What is happening right now?" Because someone's mom is getting after me. But that's COD Esports, baby. COD Twitter's undefeated. You have moms literally being like, "My son won Rookie of the Year. Quit crying." That's perfect. I'm glad we have it. Um, uh, Moving on though, like talk about the other top four team is Optic. I don't really think that there's too much to say. Obviously, like the haters, I will say, or the people that love to get like interactions on Twitter, they're gonna obviously talk about Optic and how they didn't win this event after winning champs, which was in Texas and all of that stuff. Again, like it's kind of the same deal as like if champs and esports World Cup are equivalent. Like it doesn't actually matter all that much that Optic didn't win. Nothing should change with them. Like they won the most important event of the year. They kind of get like as far as like Dashy specifically, like he got the monkey off of his back, and even though he's beefing with Patty P right now, like I think at the end of the day, like it's so of so little importance that they didn't win this. Of course, it would have been great. It would have been like a huge like feather in their cap to win this event right after winning champs and kind of cap off the season on a really really strong note. But it's really not that important. Do you agree with that? Like for Optic, it just doesn't change much for how they should
No.
like approach the off season or next season.
No. The only, and I mean, this can kind of go with FaZe too, because I don't, especially after this tournament, I don't expect FaZe uh, to make a roster move, though they have, so I guess they could. But with Optic too, I don't expect them to. The one thing, I guess maybe you can say two players, but really one player. The only player I think that realistically could alter that conversation would be Hydra. If Hydra actually becomes like a free agent and or somehow a trade is worked out or something and you're able to get him, like I feel like that's a guy that you make a change for if you can. Um to an extent, same with Scrappy, I think, but um I think that's I would say like Hydra's that one guy and then Scrappy like after him. Obviously you can say like guys like Simp and Abizi and stuff, but I don't think that's realistic. I think Hydra and Scrappy are, if they are even realistic targets, they are like just a little more realistic. And I know even Jack from C9 has already said they're extending all the guys on the New York roster, so it's potentially not even worth talking about. But yeah, outside of something absolutely bonkers like one of those top all-star caliber players becoming available, I don't expect Optic to make a change. Um, like we were just talking about with Seattle a little bit, it's the way the bracket shook out, right? Like they literally had to play C9 New York, who they played in the grand finals of champs in the first round of the winners bracket, and then they have to play FaZe in the second round of the winners bracket. Where if they were just on the other side of the bracket, they could have potentially played Vancouver Surge and 100 Thieves to get to the grand finals, right? So, um, I don't think it changes anything for Optic. I would be really surprised if it did, but you know, I probably said that same thing last year with New York and Priesta, and there ended up being a move there. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I really don't think this changes anything for Optic. It really, I feel like a little off topic, but just
Mm-hmm.
it feels like we had that top four this year of teams, but at certain points this year, the just one team in the top four was able to beat another team, but they would struggle against another team. So like I'm thinking about like
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Atlanta FaZe is like 7-1 against Optic this year, but obviously we know like Atlanta was losing to Toronto and New York at the end of the season, right? And then Optic beat Toronto and New York, but they couldn't beat FaZe
Yeah.
but one time. So it's like, I don't know, it's a weird dynamic at the top there, and that could kind of lead to less roster changes, I believe, because we had this conversation before too, where it's like, if you are one of those top four teams and you make a change, you could potentially make a team that you were not really competing with, help them be more competitive and on par with
Hmm.
you. Um, so yeah, there's definitely a ton of ways to look at this roster, man. It'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. But yeah, circling back to what you were saying, yeah, I don't think um, Optic is really in a position to need to make a change outside of something just like CDL trade of the century happening.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's a good point that you just made. Like the what is it like? What is it called? The math thing, like where um, I I haven't been in school for like years now, so I don't remember the transitive property, right? Optic beats
Yeah,
Toronto,
yeah, yeah,
Toronto
yeah.
beats FaZe, FaZe, in theory should beat New York, but that hasn't always worked out. But like even at this event, like we see that Optic beat C9 in the first round, then they lose to FaZe, and 100 Thieves they beat Toronto, and it's just like this thing where I do think you're onto something. Like it could lead to minimal to zero roster changes within that top four, because they all believe like if we just tweak a few things here and there, we're going to be able to beat, like Optic can say like we're going to be able to beat FaZe next year if we change these things, or FaZe could say like we did beat some of these other teams like New York and Toronto a few times during the season, but like consistently if we fix this stuff and we'll be good. We'll see how it works out. I think Toronto is the most interesting case here now, because they did not finish on a strong note. Of course, they finished third at champs, but then if if they do put stock in the Esports World Cup and they say, well, we didn't perform well here. We lost to 100 Thieves 2 out of the last 3 times that we played them. 100 Thieves is not necessarily considered a top four team. And of course, we lost to New York. We didn't really, I don't believe, had like a ton of success against Optic. I can't remember off the top of my head like what their head-to-head record was. But Toronto, like they started on such a strong note and they did not finish on as strong of a note. Uh, do you think the Esports World Cup, like they finished, I believe, top 8 at this event? Does that change anything with them? Of course, like the storyline throughout the season was Envoy. Like he wasn't performing up to the standard or the expectations that some had for him when he joined this team. Of course, Scrappy, he's a lock if he wants to be there, and he's under contract. If he's under contract, and I think even with like Insight and Kleenex, I think at least one of those guys is like if they're under contract, we're gonna keep them, but Toronto seems kind of like a wild card in my opinion. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I could see them potentially making a move. I do want to say though, I don't think this tournament would be that catalyst unless it
Yeah.
just caused like massive chemistry issues or something behind the scenes. One thing we haven't really mentioned yet about this tournament, and I guess we could have talked about it when we were talking about like the significance of it and whatnot, is it was only a single
Yeah.
elimination
That's what I was gonna
bracket,
bring up too.
and so Toronto gets top 8, but they literally only lost one series in just a single elim bracket. So like, how much weight can you put into that in terms of the need to make a roster change or the feeling that you need to do something? I'm not sure, and especially the way I think about some of those players on Toronto, especially guys like Scrap and Kleenex, I would be really surprised if Toronto decided to move on from them unless those guys, were seeking other opportunities or like we've been saying, they get a bag or just an offer they can't refuse from another team. Um, so it will be interesting to see how that shakes out for Toronto. I do think, especially knowing now, like what we know about C9 Jack saying, like they're they're keeping or extending all four contracts for the subliners guys. Assuming Optic doesn't make a change and assuming FaZe doesn't make a change after this tournament, it seems like if you had to pick a team in the top four that is most likely to make a change, it would probably be Toronto. But even then, I'm not entirely confident that they will make a change. But I do think you could argue that they are the most likely of the quote unquote top four from the MW3 season.
Let's talk about the single elimination real quick. Obviously, all of the CDL majors and champs double elimination, but there's no group play in those events.
Yeah.
So we just start off with 8 teams in the winners bracket, 4 teams in the losers bracket, and we have a double elimination tournament from there on. This time, this was there were 4 groups of 4 teams each, 16 teams in total, of course, and it was like Swiss. I think it's Swiss format where you play essentially teams that have like the same record as you at that moment. So obviously the first round matchups are kind of set. Optic played like Omit Brooklyn, Vegas played Carolina. Well, and then Optic and Carolina win because they each have 1 win. They played each other to advance to the bracket, and then Omit Brooklyn and Vegas because they lost. They had an 0-1 record. They played each other, and then Carolina and Vegas played in the final matchup after Vegas beat Omit Brooklyn. So that was kind of the format for this event. The top 2 teams from each group advanced to the bracket where, like you said, single elimination. Unlike anything that we've had in the CDL for at least a little bit. Like we've had single elimination tournaments. They're almost always very derisive. Like people,
like the kickoffs and pro-am.
yeah, they're really polarizing because for most of Call of Duty Esports, it's been double elimination tournaments. That's what people have like kind of grown up on at this point. What do you think about it? Because it does add something. You think of March Madness, like single elimination tournaments are exciting because there's so much importance placed on this one match. But at the same time, you don't necessarily get the best teams, or you're not really deciding the best team in that tournament necessarily.
Yeah, I think I definitely prefer double elimination in Call of Duty. I wouldn't prefer double elimination in March Madness.
Yeah.
Just say that. But in Call of Duty, we've talked about this for years now. I mean, even just going back to Vanguard, where we were literally like, it's a coin flip game where you flip the coin. Sometime a team is gonna go off, and other times they're just gonna shit the bed. It feels like a lot of these recent titles, like any team can win on any given day to some extent. And, just like looking at like 100 Thieves versus Toronto, obviously they beat them twice, so it might not apply. But um, just as like the most recent example, like, 100 Thieves, you wouldn't consider them a better team than Toronto for the entirety of this MW3 season, but they were able to show up this event yesterday and take care of business and eliminate Toronto because it's single elimination. At the same time, if it's double elimination, then Toronto has that potential to go on a crazy losers bracket run, and that's what I like the most about double elim. I just like that. You know, I like the historic nature of some of the loser brackets runs we've had in Call of Duty in particular. Um, the one thing I will say about double elimination in Call of Duty in particular is it's always been a little strange to me, especially in recent years, where it's almost like the team in the losers bracket has more of an advantage than the team in the winners bracket, because on a lot of occasions the team in the losers bracket, if they're able to win a couple matches in a row, they're really hot coming into play. That team who's in the winners bracket just like sitting around waiting, and the loser bracket teams coming in hot ready to go, and there isn't really an advantage in Call of Duty Esports in recent years for being in the winners bracket. Like it's not like in some of the CWL years where the loser bracket team had to win 2 series to take the title. It's just been one best of 7 or best of 9 in recent years. And like because of the map pools, you say like quote unquote the winners bracket team gets a veto advantage, but because of how small some of these map pools have been recently, that's not really a massive advantage in my eyes.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing I would like to see improve if hopefully double elimination sticks around is um, we find some way to actually make it a little more meaningful for that winners bracket team to be that winners bracket team in the grand finals. Um, but I do think the single elimination thing is a nice change of pace. I think like you kind of mentioned earlier in the show, it felt like there wasn't a lot of interest in the COD Esports World Cup tournament, and I feel like if it was double elimination, it kind of would have just dragged on a little bit more.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it was cool. I will say some in the start of the tournament we had the group play and there were two streams going on at once. I was going back and forth in my tabs to watch them because I don't have two monitors, and it brought me back to some of those old MLG CW events where I had to have the four streams on at once for Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta or whatever, and like watching four games and all that. So that was a little cool for me from a nostalgic standpoint, but at the same time I'm not sure if
It's not
that's
going to catch on.
necessarily, yeah. Um, End of the day, though, we've talked about it this season when early halfway through the season or whatever, we had that like future of the CDL post where it kind of seems like CDL sticking around and potentially the door is open a little bit more for expansion than in previous seasons. If there is expansion, was this Esports World Cup tournament like kind of a little preview at what a 16 team tournament could look like? I don't think the CDL would do a single elim for like a major or champs. Um, but definitely like, with the group play sort of aspect back in, that's been a thing that we've talked about and the community has seemingly talked about where it's not like you're just playing a bracket and you only have to win 3 series to win a whole tournament. You got to play your group play and then um, that gets you seeded into the bracket and whatnot. So it's more
Mm.
matches really, but um, end of the day, that's all speculation, but it could be just something to keep in the back burner there. And who knows? Obviously, the CDL wasn't really involved in this tournament, as far as I'm aware. Um, so they might not really care what the Esports World Cup did for a format. It might not matter, but um, could be something to think about going forward.
I do think the CDL would be open to it if it was like logistically like more favorable for them. I think Adam Apicella has talked about like the multi-stream kind of thing in the past about like how it's not. I I mean, as far as I remember, it was like it's just not like perceived to be really good for viewers or like the people doing it. Like it's obviously a lot of things going on all at once. So it probably won't return at least like on a full time basis, but I do think there is like a nostalgic kind of aspect to it. As far as single elimination goes, like I like single elimination in general, but for Call of Duty, it doesn't work, especially when you have best of fives. If it were a best of nine, a best of 11, then like, yeah, you could have a single elimination because you're playing every map. The only thing is, and this is actually something I was thinking about when you were talking, you could realistically do a best of nine, best of 11 single elimination and have the teams switch sides, like actually switch setups uh, halfway through, kind of like a halftime, like where they switch the sides of the field. Like that could be a solution and something to think about. Of course, best of nines or a best of 11, like that would be like several hours of a series, which you kind of have to find like a happy medium. Whether best of five sometimes can be really quick. Like a 3 game series can be what 35 45 minutes. Like
Yeah.
it could be over like in an instant, um which doesn't necessarily, it's not always the greatest thing when it's a super quick series, from I'm sure from an advertiser's point of view, but best of 9, best of 11, those things can drag at a certain point, so it's kind of about finding that happy medium again. um yeah.
I think best of 11 is my roots with Black Ops 1 and being an old head there. I really liked the continuation series. So what they would do if like let's just say Optic C9 played in the winners round, it was a 3-1. and then C9 makes it through the loser bracket to the grand finals against Optic, it would start, instead of being like a best of 5, they would say it's a best of 11 with Optic up 3-1,
Mm-hmm.
and then it would be a best of 11 from there. Apparently, I don't know if it was ever like officially announced. It might have been, just like speculation and rumors in the community, but that was like, I think that was part of along the same lines of like the double uh having to win two series thing, where it was like kind of deemed or speculated that it was like too complicated for more casual viewers, and that's the reason it's kind of been steered away from in the CDL. But I am definitely a fan of the best of 11 concepts or continuation series if that is something that um, could be implemented. But I do think um, that's not likely at this juncture.
It is not likely. We're we're not about likely things anyway. The continuation would definitely give that advantage that you've kind of been
Yes.
talking about. Like you wouldn't have like, oh, this team doesn't get like, no, that is literally the biggest advantage that you could possibly have in that case. Or obviously the two best of fives. I could see in a scenario like a fan of like traditional sports, they do not understand like the idea of a bracket reset. Like I can understand that they would not understand that. Of course, I think they would probably get it after like the bracket actually resets. And they're like, okay,
Yeah.
now this best of five is the last one. But I don't really see the idea of like fans wouldn't get that this team who beat the other team 3-1, they have a 3-1 lead going into this grand finals and they only need to win, three more maps to win the series. Like I don't really get that idea. And I also think the continuation is like just a good idea in general because you have some of these events where teams are beating 3-0 and then they play again and like the other team wins 3-2, and then you look at like, so in reality one team won 5 maps and got eliminated and the other
Yep.
team won 3 maps against that team and they're moving
That was
on.
always the thing that people would complain about with the continuation series back in the day. It's like, yeah, you won more maps after the continuation, but you actually lose. I think that was the thing with like BO2 champs. Um,
Yeah,
was I
BO2 was Envy versus Freako, and I think it was a best of 11. And
Yeah, and I think like Envy technically, I don't remember. I just remember that being at a
yeah,
talking point for sure.
but yeah, I don't think single eliminations, at least for the majors and everything, I don't think that'll be coming back or making an appearance. We could see it with the Pro Am because this is kind of like the Pro Am this season. Like this
Yeah.
was, we had 5 of the challengers teams. We had 11 CDL teams. They did like a mini group play and then they did the playoffs. I thought it was interesting though that none of the challengers teams made it out of group play. Um, it does not say much, of course, because there's 8 spots in the bracket. There were there were 11 CDL teams, so like overwhelmingly, like the CDL teams in theory should get that, but there wasn't even one. Like the Boston Breach of all teams made it out of group
But
play.
I will say the Boston Breach roster is 3/4 of a Challengers roster that
Yeah,
played pretty well towards the end of the season.
yeah,
And I mean, if you do, you look at the breakdown of the placings. 3 of the 4 teams that were in top 12 were Challengers teams, and 3 teams from the CDL: G2/Minnesota, Miami Heretics. Wait, that's not. How does that work? Oh, it's because there's only 11 CDL teams. But
yeah.
so Minnesota and Miami didn't get. They got top 16 and were outplaced by 3 challengers team in Gentlemates, Stallions, and Lore Gaming. So even though they weren't able to push into that winners bracket, we did see some scenarios where challengers teams were outplacing some of these uh, CDL franchises. I think Heretics was probably the more surprising to me than G2. Like G2 played against uh, Seattle and Gentlemates, and Gentlemates beat them 3-2. I think they won both searches, but G2 was also playing with like half the Minnesota roster in accuracy and lens and half of LAG with um Estriel and Diamond Con, so it wasn't really like the actual Minnesota roster that had been together for a while. Whereas Miami Heretics, or they were just playing as Team Heretics, they lose to Boston and Stallions, so I think that was a little
Yeah.
more surprising to me. But nevertheless, yeah, I do think outside of Boston, you were probably expecting, if there's 8 teams in that bracket, all 8 teams being CDL teams isn't a huge shocker.
Yeah. I think Heretics and G2 were the only CDL teams to even lose to a challengers team at this event. So, um, that's, I guess that's interesting in a way. Um, I don't know like really what it says about like the challenger scene at all. Like obviously the challenger scene is not in a good place, just like from a like sustainability standpoint, but there's a ton of talent still regardless. Like Arcides, who's a multiple time world champion, is on a challengers team. We had multiple former CDL players on these teams as well. So it and like you said with Boston specifically, they were the worst team, one of the worst teams in CDL history, and yet they brought in multiple former CDL players, but also challengers players, and they kind of overperformed, at least according to like what people probably thought of them coming into this event, considering they won like whatever 6 matches all season long, and they won like 2 or 3 this weekend. So it's interesting, but not sure how much we can really glean from the Esports World Cup stuff. Any teams jump out, or any other storylines that you're interested in talking about coming out of this event? Again, $1.8 million, only $200,000 less than champs, but it's in Saudi Arabia. It's there are a bunch of like Falcons, who was a Saudi Arabian team. Like they didn't really do much, except they came close to who they almost beat Lore, but it just didn't seem like this was kind of like a huge event, but it might have some big implications down the road.
Yeah, no, I do want to say the Falcons versus FaZe match was closer than
Mm-hmm.
I expected. Like it was 250 to 175 in the hard point, 6-3 in the search, 3-0 in the control. So those first 2 maps, like if it, I was pretty boisterous, I would say, about this matchup in the preview show, saying like I was expecting like a 50-point club and a shutout in the control and searches. So it was definitely a little closer than I was expected. But those guys, they had some stretches there. The one guy with the name that we were unsure about saying or whatever didn't have that name at the tournament too. That was a weird one for me. Um, but yeah, no, I think some of these teams, like I don't know, Carolina with Beans was kind of cool to see. Them do well. Obviously, I know both of us really like Clay, but um, it seemed like Beans played pretty well at this event, and it'll be interesting to see. Again, talking from a roster mania perspective, it feels like Carolina should want to build around Gwen and keep him around, but does now Beans like earn the shot to stick around on Carolina, or was this just like a one-time thing? Not really sure. Um, I guess we kind of talked about Toronto and New York to an extent. Like, you know,
Yeah, with some of
they
these
get
teams,
top.
it's tough just because like you know they had like an entire season where they proved that they're like a championship level roster, and while there might be roster changes, I think ultimately like a team like C9, if they're gonna make a roster change, don't make it on the Esports World Cup placing where
Yeah,
you lose to Optic like that. That's at least my opinion on that.
yeah, for sure. No, I think yeah, for what it was and how it shook out, I think it was a pretty. There was definitely some technical issues and whatnot. A lot of conversations about like um Call of Duty not really being on land because of PC and stuff like that. I saw that going around in the community because there was a lot of lag outs and losing connection and stuff because the players weren't using the CDL accounts. I think they were using just like regular accounts and like playing in hosted lobbies and whatnot. So, there always be this will just be one of those tournaments that's kind of, like talked about, and how much importance and weight is significance is put on it is up for debate. But end of the day, I think, it was the MW3 season's over now. It was cool to have another event to round things out. I think champs obviously would have been a pretty good ending to the season, just the way that all shook out too. It was an awesome event. But um, yeah, this is where we're at now. Season's finally over, and it's roster mania time.
Yeah. This is something that actually happened before the Esports World Cup, but JKap, LA Thieves, or now 100 Thieves, their head coach, he announced that he will not be a part of the organization moving forward. Of course, 100 Thieves based in Los Angeles. He said he's moving back to the East Coast. I think he's from New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. And so he's going back home, and he's open to coaching opportunities as he transitions back to the East Coast. And I mean, it's an interesting development for 100 Thieves. Obviously, it did not slow them down at the Esports World Cup necessarily, but JKap has been a part of that organization for a few seasons. He was much maligned, I think, during his first season, if I'm not mistaken, because of all the roster changes that they made that year. But obviously, won a world championship 2 years ago now. With LA Thieves, had a very, very good roster last season, and I think overperformed, compared to expectations, at least this season. I think there should be a lot of interest in him, at least, even if it's an assistant coach. We've seen Sender join like NYSL as like an assistant. We've seen other former players join other teams, like even Accuracy. I don't know if he was considered a coach, but he was helping out Optic in the lead up to champs, allegedly. And I'm sure JKap could really add a lot of in-game intelligence and a lot of experience for sure to whatever team. Any thoughts on JKap leaving 100 Thieves?
Yeah, definitely wasn't necessarily expecting it, but obviously circumstances outside the game led to it. If he's moving across the country and 100 Thieves want their people in LA, like, it's just gonna not work out. But yeah, will be interesting to see. He did say looking for any remote opportunities, and it sounded like kind of potentially if like a coaching opportunity doesn't come up, he might do like streaming or content stuff. So that'd be kind of cool. Um, but I do think he's one of my favorite players going back to when I first got into COD. I just think he's a really great mind, has a really great mind for the game. And like you said, even if, no head coaching opportunity pops up because of him wanting to work remote, I think even a team like, I don't think Optic needs a coach because they have Karma and JP, but like, let's just say that, a team like Optic there would be able to take a chance on having a remote coach just because of the other people they have involved in the operation and whatnot. And JKap played for Optic and Envy for a while, so that'd be a cool matchup if they made that work. But yeah, I think that's probably more realistic, unless, who knows, maybe with the Boston Breach news that we're about to talk about, maybe a New Jersey team comes in and JKap's able to be the head coach right in his home state.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Boston Breach. Of course, they have, we've talked quite a bit this whole season about them. Pretty much none of it good. They posted, I think, a 6-27 record this season. And even though they did finish on a relatively high note at the Esports World Cup, I think like this is obviously like pretty depressing news, at least from my point of view. This broke, about a week and a half ago, but Oxygen Esports, which is the parent company of the Boston Breach, they have reportedly laid off all of its staff, and said that, and told employees that, it's kind of over, like they're not going to be in competitive gaming anymore, that, the Boston Breach would seemingly kind of cease to exist at that point. I think it was Dixerdo, Jacob Hale. He said his report was that the Breach players were notified that they'll lose access to the Helix, which is the like Foxborough-based
Yeah.
facility. They'll lose access to the Helix facility and be out of their apartments by August 8th, which I would just say is the scummiest thing that has happened in Call of Duty for a little bit. This was less than a week before they were set to fly out to Saudi Arabia for the Esports World Cup, and they were being told, at least according to this report, that they were not only not going to have access to the practice facility that they've had access to, presumably throughout the entire season, but they were also going to be kicked out of their apartments in the Boston area just days before leaving home to fly across the world to play and represent this organization. Of course, Boston, they overperformed. They got top 8. I'm trying to look real quick to see how much money that was. That's $80,000.
Yeah.
So I hope that they get all 80, minus tax, of course. I don't think Saudi Arabia actually has tax, so I don't know how that works. But anyway, like, this is a really screwed up situation that none of these players, none of the coaches, none of the employees deserve to go through. But I'd like to get your thoughts on this, because it obviously, we've talked about it in the past, like Boston has, or the Breach specifically, has done a good job with its Call of Duty stuff, that they were the newest team to the CDL, but they were like fully embracing it. They were like really trying hard with content and trying to be like, an actual CDL franchise, unlike some of these other teams. And it just kind of sucks that all of this is happening. So I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
So the one thing I will say about the like apartment and moving aspect of the report, obviously I don't, I think Jacob Hale's a really good reporter. He's done a lot of good work over the years here. The only thing that isn't clear to me from the outside looking in is that because of the roster changes with Boston, were Cammy, Awakening, and Purge actually living in apartments in Boston, and like were they even there? I just don't know that. So it's possible that that part of the report is referring to some of the guys who were no longer on the team. Like, I can't even think of the roster off the top of my head now. Holy shit.
Wasn't Major Maniac would have been on
Major,
the
Major Maniac, Priesta, and Beans, but obviously Beans was with Carolina. Is that Jesus? I can't even. That's bad. Wow.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, though, that whole thing aside, I just think if this report does come to fruition and Oxygen / Boston Breach is leading, I think that's a pretty big hit to COD Esports, just because of the way they came in to the scene not too long ago. And to me, I thought it was really noticeable, and it stood out that we've had these events over the past couple years where some organizations just have either like not decided to host an event or volunteer to host an event, or they have volunteered and then they aren't able to follow through, and then we have to have these events where there's no fans, and just whatever situations happen with those. That's happened at least twice that I remember. While that's all gone on in recent years with other franchises, Boston has been one of the few organizations to regularly throw its name into the hat to host an event, and they hosted 2 events in Boston, one of which I attended, and I really thought they did a good job, especially considering that was the one I went to was their first time hosting an event in Call of Duty. And it we've talked about teams like Paris / Vegas, right? Where like that they obviously have not seemingly at all tried to host an event since being in the league. And we've talked about them seemingly from the outside looking in being unwilling to spend money, whereas a team like Boston comes in and right away is looking at these opportunities. They're hosting events. They were signing in theory, high value players or veterans who are costing more than some of like the rookies that a team like Vegas has signed in recent years. So I just think, yeah, like that's if it comes through, then that this happens and Oxygen / Boston is leaving. I think it's, it sucks to see them go, because I do think it was cool to have them come in and see them, being willing to try and put together competitive rosters immediately and be willing to host events when other rosters and franchises in the league seemingly haven't put that same effort in to what we saw Boston do in less amount of time. So, um, at the same time, if it does happen that, Boston leaves, that does open the door for another organization to come in and do what Boston did, right? And spend big and host these events. To play devil's advocate, it also
Mhm.
opens the door for an organization to come in and do what a team like Vegas has done and not seemingly not spend a ton of money, pay players close to the minimum reportedly, allegedly, and just not host events. So, very, you know, delicate situation, could go either way. And with questions around just like what the future of the CDL looks like, how many teams there are even going to be, all that yada yada. This just sets it up to be a bit more interesting from, this could be a more interesting roster mania period from an organizational standpoint than the actual players themselves,
Yeah, it's true.
especially if we're seeing turnover with some of these organizations. It's possible we see more org changes than roster changes.
Yeah, I mean we're looking at, of course it's a 12-team league, but we're looking at like almost 20% of the league, the actual teams changing, because like who knows what happens with the Gorillas. Like this has been like a
Yep.
2-year long saga with them, that is punctuated by the fact that LAG was the only CDL team not to go the Esports World Cup. So like that's a part of it. Of course, Boston with this situation, like it doesn't seem like it's too much up in the air, more as like this seems like it might actually happen. Like I didn't see anything like where like people working with
Yeah,
Boston
yeah, yeah.
were like coming out and saying like, no, this isn't true. Like that to me says so much more. Like that silence is almost deafening in this case. So that's really unfortunate, and I feel really bad for all of the staff members and of course the players and all of that, and the coaches and all and everybody involved, because that's a really really crappy situation, that could have been avoided. Like even if Oxygen was going to go out of business and they're like, okay, we're not gonna fund this anymore. This is, and I've said this in the past before. I think I said it when we were talking about the Gorillas and the possibility of them leaving and like laying off people and all that stuff. It's Oxygen Esports is part of the Kraft Sports Entertainment, whatever it's called, Robert Kraft's company, right? Robert Kraft is a billionaire with a B. It is not. It's no sweat off his back to say, hey, giving you 90 days notice, to all of our Breach employees, all of our Oxygen Esports employees. We're going out of business. So in 90 days, you're no longer going to get paid. You're no longer going to have an apartment. You're not going to whatever. Like everything is ceasing to exist in 90 days. 90 days gives those people, it's still very stressful. It's a horrible situation, but 90 days would give them 3 months to get their stuff in order and allow these people to look for new jobs, look for new apartments, all of that stuff. That's a really crappy situation, and I'd love to get an update from JKap or somebody else about the situation, because I'm sure, even if the apartments stay, the fact that all of this came out days before they were set to leave the country for a tournament, I'm sure was nerve wracking. Like what's going to happen? Like I'm going to be gone for, a week, and I don't know what's going to happen when I get back from Saudi Arabia. So I really empathize with everybody, with Oxygen at the moment, and it's just been happening way too often, not only in Call of Duty but in esports in general. We've seen multiple organizations kind of just go by, like they're done within a few weeks notice. But of course as a Call of Duty Esports podcast, we've talked about it so much at this point. The amount of turnover that we've had from the original CDL before 2020 to now, it's staggering. Like we have very few teams that are the same ownership group, same branding, all of that. Like we have Atlanta FaZe. Is that it? Like,
No, hold on. I'm gonna go back.
because I was thinking, like, obviously we don't have the Dallas Empire, we don't have the Chicago Huntsmen, we don't have the Minnesota Rocker, Seattle Surge, OGLA is now LAT, LAG I guess exists, so they're one. Atlanta FaZe, we don't have the Florida
LG in
Mutineers.
Toronto.
Yeah, so Toronto, LAG, and Atlanta. LAG, we assume at some point it maybe they will cease to exist, but right now they exist. So yeah, that's a really crappy situation. Like 3 out of the original 12 are at least
Minnesota
different.
will count if the merger. Well, they merge with G2, but they haven't
Yeah,
changed brands, but they might. So maybe
yeah.
3.5.
Yeah, so I was counting Minnesota changing
Yeah,
to G2, and at least it's a new ownership group, no matter what, because it was the
true.
Will family that started, and now it's going to be G2 Esports or whatever. So, really unfortunate. Hopefully, this kind of turnover and all the changes that have happened over the last few years, hopefully, it will help esports in the long run become more sustainable and better for the people involved, because of course the owners, they're making however much money regardless a lot of times about like what's happening, but like the people like working for these companies, they're the ones hurt the most by these situations because they're just normal people working normal jobs, trying to make a living in esports, which, as we both know, is not the easiest thing in the world. Best of luck to everybody involved in the oxygen stuff. Best of luck involved into the LAG stuff because that's been going on for so long at this point. And hopefully things will change. Hopefully things will get better as we continue to move on in Call of Duty Esports. Yeah, roster mania. I obviously we haven't had anything drop to this point. We had some roster moves before the Esports World Cup. I don't. I tend not to think. I'd like to get your thoughts. Do you think it'd actually be the worst roster mania ever? Because I'm of the opinion that just because teams made roster changes already does not mean that they won't make another one. And it's also about dominoes. If Hydra,
Yes,
for example,
yes,
is like,
yes.
yeah, I don't want to be with Cloud9 or whatever. I don't see that happening. But just as a potential item, like then everything changes. Like any
Yep.
single team in the CDL could be affected by that kind of move, or even Scrappy, any of the FaZe guys, like that changes what happens for the rest of the league.
I'll say last year, I mean, the LA Thieves roster of Octane, Envoy, Kenny, and Draza, like if you told me they were going to stick around, even though last year wasn't as successful as the previous year for them, um, I wouldn't have been surprised. And then Octane retires. That was kind of like the first domino to fall, if I remember correctly. And then we get like I don't I think we got the news after Octane retired about like them losing 2 million or whatever it was on the championship winning team in 2022, and them wanting to like you know build towards profitability or whatever. So then we were kind of getting the inclination that the other 3 guys on the roster were going their separate ways. And then obviously there was the reports that like Draza was deciding between Optic and FaZe. He ends up going to FaZe, which opens the door for Kenny to go to Optic. And like, so that's the kind of thing that, you know, I don't know what would be that major LAT like domino in 2024 as we had last year. But if something like that happens, then yeah, I think we could be in for an interesting roster mania. I think, as much as we're talking about the potential for like these top 4 teams to not make moves, even if they don't, that's still 8 teams in
Yeah.
theory. I mean, even if you want to just say like we don't know what's going on with Boston and LAG, like that's fine. At least
Those
half of the league should be making roster moves. And it's just going to come down to who those players are, who they're going after, and um what that leads to. And like you said, the dominoes is one major domino falls that can just change everything. And that's what I enjoy the most about roster mania. I think one thing, someone we probably haven't talked about a lot outside of just mentioning how happy he is um of Boston's struggles, not from an organization and layoff standpoint, but just in-game performance is Slasher. We obviously haven't seen him competing in recent months, and he's a name we know what he's capable of. And does one of these other teams give him a chance to sort of build a roster around him and get some young guns on the SMGs, let him set a system and whatnot. That's interesting. You mentioned Arcides could be another opportunity for him after he does well in challengers there. Um, but just again to play devil's advocate, we had last year was um, Gwyn and GodRx winning the challengers champs if I remember correctly, and I know I was really excited about GodRx getting another opportunity in the CDL this year, and that did not work out, and he promptly retired before the first event of the year. So a lot of things can happen. A lot of things might not play out the way you expect, and that's what makes this fun. So, um, yeah, I'm not ready to put a pin and say, oh, this roster mania is going to suck because a lot of the really good teams aren't going to make changes. I'm not ready to do that, but um, we'll just have to see what these other teams are willing to do to try and get up to the caliber of those quote unquote top four if those top four do end up sticking.
It's all about it. Like it comes in waves because contracts usually align. Like we've seen in the past few years, like there's a ton of free
Yeah.
agents one season, and then because it's a 2 or 3 year contract, the next year is not as eventful, at least at like the top level. And I think that's probably going to happen this year because we had so much movement between the top teams last off season. Like Optic was overhauled. FaZe made a big change. Toronto made a change. Even New York, who won the world championship, they made a change. So like that, I think changes like how this off season will go. And I would expect Optic not to make any changes. I expect New York, personally, not to make changes, especially since Jack already said C9 will has already re-signed and all of that. So I think those two are pretty much locks or closer to locks than the rest. I think FaZe won't make a change, and then Toronto is the wild card, like I mentioned. I am not sure exactly what to expect of them, and that like we mentioned earlier, could affect any of the teams. And then it trickles down, and you like the top or the bottom 8 teams, like aside from 100 Thieves, like I think everybody else is guaranteed to make a change at this point. I would be shocked if a team like Vancouver, a team like G2, like it would be stunning if they didn't make a change. These teams always make roster swaps, and it's always different from what we saw from them last. So I expect that to continue. But if you're just looking at the top level talent, yeah, you could say it potentially has, like, it could have the worst outcome where there's not very much movement with, the top 10, 15 players. But I mean, that just happens. And that means next off season or two off seasons from now, it's going to be crazy because that's how it almost always is. But yeah, I think that about does it. We're about hour 20. I don't know if you had any other things you wanted to talk about before we get out of here.
I just want to give one shout out to Exposed. For those who don't know, he is a streamer who does a lot of gambling content now, if I know, but beforehand he used to play a lot of GBs and wagers back in the day.
Yeah.
I got my first introduction to him in World War II when I was watching him at my cousin's house when Scump raided him and he proceeded to crack eggs over the top of his head in excitement. Um, so that was my introduction to Exposed, and it was kind of funny. This happened on uh, Friday night, I believe. Yeah, Friday night after I was hanging out with my cousin, who I was just mentioning, and I saw this that Marky B like kind of like tweeted about um, how he was in challengers this last year, but he's got bills and stuff to pay and doesn't know if he what he's gonna do if he doesn't get an opportunity to coach in the CDL or basically for a salary. And Exposed said, I got you with your bills for an entire year so you can continue to do what you love, hit the DMs. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Exposed for that because that's just a freaking awesome thing to do. Good for Marky B. Obviously, we don't know how it's going to play out and whatnot. I think Marky B's been a pretty good coach, especially on some teams that didn't, thinking back to like an LAG team, we've talked about the LAG as an organization not probably giving him, all of the resources necessary to succeed, and he was still able to make some stuff happen. So I think Marky B is a good guy, and another good COD mind that I would like to see stick around. And if Exposed is able to help that happen, then just wanted to give a quick shout out there.
Yeah. Obviously awesome. Like that's really really cool. I also think Marky B might have been like he got screwed, at least in my opinion, because if I remember correctly, he left Toronto to go to LAG to be their head coach and maybe even their GM. And then like months later, LAG kind of like imploded and decided to lay off like pretty much everybody and cease operations, all that good stuff. Like the stuff that we've been talking about during this podcast. I think that was that season. And of course, like I don't think Marky B came back the next year with LAG. So it just obviously Marky B has been around. He's like one of the most influential figures in like European COD history, at least. And he was very instrumental in how Toronto has kind of been one of the more competitive teams in CDL history. So, love that for Marky B. He also had that one great moment at whatever major that was. So he'll always have that at least. But yeah, that's really awesome of Exposed to do that for him. But yeah, that about does it. I mean, obviously, we don't have a ton to talk about like in the off season. Maybe there will be a bunch of roster mania stuff. Teams are unreliable in that area, though. Like when they do it, some teams wait until the first week of CDL action, and let me break it to you. I hate those teams. I despise those teams. But I'm sure that's going to happen at some point. But we will be back eventually. Of course, it's kind of football season, both for me and just for like the general public. And I think we're both going to be busy. Bink with his fantasy teams and me with high school football. But we will obviously be back at some point, and maybe just do like a check-in kind of random off-season pod to kind of discuss some of the things that we always push off during the regular season. But we will definitely be back at some point. Make sure to subscribe or like or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music. And if you follow or subscribe to those feeds, then you will know when we actually have another episode. And we really appreciate all your support. We've said this, I think, on the last podcast, but it's always cool to see how much people have been kind of tuning in and listening and watching. So we appreciate you. You can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2K, at 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and podcast Twitter at Ego Chall Podcast. If you follow me, fair warning, there will be a lot of high school sports stuff from the Mahoning Valley. So that's kind of like, I'm trying to make you not want to follow me, I guess, at that point. But yeah, that's my job. You will actually get maybe some esports tweets from Bink, mostly just like Yankees tweets. I think maybe some Steelers stuff coming up. But yeah, our next show, maybe in a few weeks. Who knows? Obviously, it's been a few weeks since our last episode. But yeah, it's gonna happen at some point.
I will say we got COD next, August 28th. That'll be our multiplayer reveal and, zombies reveal, I think, too. The big stream previewing Black Ops 6, August 28th there. And then the beta for Black Ops 6 starts on August 30th to September 4th for those who get codes or pre-order the game. The open beta is the following weekend from September 6th to September 9th. So at the very least, we should have some Black Ops 6 stuff we could potentially talk about after COD next and the beta. But like Preston said, you'll just have to wait and hear from us when we're going live again. And whenever that is, you'll hear us then.
Yeah, so that's about 2 weeks from now, or about that. So you might hear from us in 2 weeks, maybe 3. But we're not going to go months without doing the podcast because I think we did that like after our first season of the podcast, and I just don't think it works very well. Like it's hard to get into a rhythm at that point. But the podcast won't be as regular as the regular season, but you will get them at least once a month at the very, very minimum. And if teams decide that they want to actually announce their rosters and announce changes before then you might actually get more regular podcasts. That's really on the CDL teams. It's their fault if we're not doing regular episodes. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. Like Preston was saying, finally MW3 season officially in the books. And yeah, we got Black Ops 6 just around the corner. I know I'm really excited about zombies in particular. Return of round based zombies has got me. Can you hear me? Yeah. Are we still live or no? I yeah. I think I just lost internet because I still have power. But anyway, yeah. I mean, wait, you want me to do the whole thing again for the end, or yeah? So, uh, I'm excited about round-based zombies coming back in Black Ops 6, and first time in a while that I'm looking forward to a new COD reveal. So, that's coming around the corner, and you'll hear from us when you hear from us. But yeah, other than that, sorry about this little interruption at the end. Thank you for all the support in the MW3 season, and remember to send the chow.